They have me on a very short leash here, so I'm going to be very efficient with my comments and quick. And obviously today I'm going to discuss the third leg of the stool: environment, urban, ag. Some call it the third rail. And I hope to tee up some ideas which will be challenged and maybe outright rejected by the panel here. And I'm going to start with everything I've ever learned about biology I learned from Peter Moyle, so you can blame him for all my mistakes here. But conventional biological wisdom suggests that native species are well adapted to drought. I mean, we know that they're well adapted to drought, and they're likely to bounce back when the rains come again. So why do we sweat so much about the environment? That's because conventional wisdom is out the window when it comes to native biodiversity here in California. First, the majority of our freshwater-dependent species are already at risk due to low population levels. So we don't have that natural resiliency within our populations for bouncing back. The second aspect of this is, yeah, they bounce back in an area where you have 700,000 acres of wetlands, for example, in the Delta. Of course they bounce back when the water comes again. So we have both degraded populations and degraded environments, so they don't come back. And that's why you have to spend a tremendous amount of time and energy focusing on managing ecosystems during drought, because this becomes one of the limiting factors. Indeed, it leads to extinctions. So it matters greatly how we manage this during the drought. And of course, there's very practical reasons to do this. What we know now is the best example comes from the Delta during 1987 to 1992, our last 6-year drought. And we may be entering year 4 of a 6-year drought, and keep that in mind. One of the things that happened there is we kept the Delta salty for an entire 6-year period with hardly a break. And something happened during that period of time, and that is a set of invasive species moved in, which is familiar to all of you, the Brazilian waterweed and the overbite clam, became firmly established within the Delta, which has a legacy effect which has cost us at least hundreds of millions of dollars and may even be adding up into billions of dollars. So poor management during a drought can cost us a tremendous amount later, and as all of you know today, because this is the kind of place where this information travels very fast, the Supreme Court refused to hear the Delta biop Delta smelt biop today, and so this issue is not going away. The Supreme Court's not going to change that. Okay. As we've heard most of the day, drought offers us a chance to learn from this. And to be clear, I want to say when we learn from our mistakes, I'm not implying that the agencies have made mistakes. In fact, I would argue the agencies have done a heroic job of managing this drought. Indeed, I want to point out that DWR, in particular with Fish and Wildlife and the State Water Resources Control Board, have had to do an incredibly difficult amount of work in a short period of time. Having said that, that's usually how we lead up to saying, however, perhaps it could be done better. And so let's learn from this drought, and here are my 3 overarching recommendations for what to do better. The first comes from Jane's wonderful talk, is prepare. As the discussion of the previous panel and our own anecdotal experience shows that pre-drought investments really pay off. They have in the urban sector. The $12 billion that Southern California put into its water sector after the 87-92 drought really paid dividends. But we don't do that on the environment side. For various reasons that Peter can describe to us, we tend not to think about the environment in that way. Instead, the way we do it is we set a series of sort of baseline conditions which we then repeatedly violate. And that's basically our approach. So we're very reactive and very passive. We're very reactive and passive. So I guess it's sort of passive-aggressive. We do these, and we make these decisions on the fly, such as we were doing this year. So much on the fly that you'd think we didn't think drought would come. That's going to be one of my major points here, is we can prepare. There are no surprises in this drought when it comes to the environment. Everything we saw happen over the last 3 years, we easily could predict would happen. But what was surprising is how little preparation we had in advance. So first of all, what I suggest, what we learned from Jane's talk is what Australia did, is they designated priority habitats. Now they did it on the fly during the drought. We can do it beforehand. And during droughts, it's extremely important to identify where you get the most benefit per acre foot of water. The state needs to identify those rivers and streams that are of highest biodiversity priority and to begin to emphasize that. And that means being selective. Okay, some of you will view that as triage. Some of you will deciding that some are more precious than others. But this is part of an overall biodiversity strategy, is we have to identify those. Things like spring-fed systems, where the cold water is within these systems, a potential high-quality habitat, willing landowners, refugia, identified drought refugia. These are all necessary, and these are things that were done in Australia. The second aspect of this, of course, it doesn't matter if you find high-quality habitat if you haven't got the water to water it. So in this case, working before a drought rather than during a drought to actually identify your available water and to lock up your available water and identify those sources to be put to priority ecosystem uses. So acquiring water rights is key. And by the way, let me add one other thing that Jay said, which got kind of lost in here. Do dry runs. Had we done dry runs, we would have seen all of the things we came up against this year. So I'm glad Jay brought up the dry runs. The second is funding. Second big deal is funding. As the recent PPIC report on water finance noted, the environment is one of the fiscal orphans in California water. It absolutely lacks a reliable funding source. And as we found, bonds don't really do much for us. You need continuous, regular funding. Here's several suggestions. First, on the bond, spend it wisely. In the bond, there's very little language about drought resilience associated for the ecosystem benefits that come from the roughly $1.5 billion of the bond that's supposed to benefit ecosystems. So to the agencies that are going to actually be doling this money out, ask a fundamental question. Does this improve drought resilience? Does investment in 100 acre-foot of green, warm water really worth it environmentally, whereas 10 acre-feet of clear, cold water produces much greater benefit? The second is we need to have that conversation, and I hope the panelists will have that conversation about a dedicated funding source. We really need a dedicated, reliable source of money for ecosystem health because the ecosystem is there every year, and we shouldn't be looking at appropriations from the legislature in an emergency 3 months too late in a drought emergency to do this. So I'm going to suggest a couple things to think about. First of all, the unthinkable, per acre foot surcharge. That's right, a public goods charge on water. We talk about it every year and then we forget about it because it's too controversial, but more and more we're seeing that this is probably the way we're going to have to go in the future in some way, shape, or form to meet these. And of course, it's valuable to think about these because of the reduced cost associated with regulation after the drought is over. Because the one thing we know, it will rain again and everyone will forget about it. And then I'll be back in business as Dr. Doom when the next flood comes. Finally, the last thing I want to mention here is plans. One of the things that struck me in watching what went on this year is, again, I'll come back to this point, there were no surprises. From my point of view, there were really no surprises. There were some small little bits here and there, but overall, we could have predicted most everything on the ecosystem side that occurred this year. But we have no plan to deal with that. I am personally tired of plans, and I won't mention any plans by name, but I'm personally tired of plans, but we really don't have a plan. That is a deliberative approach involving coordinated actions which would have reduced the impact on the ecosystems. So what I'm suggesting is rather than modifying the innumerable plans that we have, and we have many of them, recovery plans, the Bay-Delta Conservation Plan, we need an overarching approach to managing biodiversity and managing biodiversity to be resilient during these droughts. Okay, so I'm going to suggest another plan, which is to be put together by what I'm calling the Biodiversity Task Force. We need that Biodiversity Task Force, which has a certain amount of independence from the agencies, to go ahead and do that retrospective on what happened in this, to harvest the lessons from this existing drought, and come forward with some proposals, some of which will be highly controversial, which is why I think you need to step back a little bit from the agencies, for how we might take that knowledge, what we gain from that knowledge, and apply it to the next drought, and maybe even in this drought. It was Dwight Eisenhower who famously noted, plans are nothing and planning is everything. When it comes to ecosystem management during the latest drought, I think we would have benefited a little bit from both. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, so we've got a great lineup here. I'm going to give a little introduction and we'll kick off the discussion. First, right next to me, we have Chuck Bonham, who is the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And those of you who have heard him speak before know that he often starts out, I'm going to steal your line, he starts out by saying he's got the best job in California, maybe in the world, at least in California.
World, what the heck?
Okay. I will just add that I think he also has one of the toughest jobs, and it's been a really tough job this year, and you've spoken eloquently on some of those challenges and in trying to do some of the balancing that's needed to be done this year. And he's got fish and he's got wildlife, so it kind of covers the whole spectrum. We've got Sandy Matsumoto, who is with the Nature Conservancy. You know, a lot of times when we talk about water and not enough of it, we just talk about fish, but birds also really need this water. And Sandy heads the migratory bird program at TNC, and birds have really been recognized as a big constituent, I would say, maybe this year, just given the shortages of water that have been available. So we're really glad to be able to bring that perspective to the panel too. Then we've got Peter Moyle, who is professor of fish biology at UC Davis, and you know, probably the state's freshwater fish guy, and who has done detailed surveys over the years of how the fish are doing in California, and with ideas for how to make them do better and so on. And I know one of the things you were doing this summer when the classes were out was going around and checking out what was going on in the watersheds and thinking about what works and what doesn't. And then we have Tim Quinn, who is head of the Association of California Water Agencies, which, you know, the biggest association for both urban and ag water agencies. Tim is also, I think, one of the most thoughtful people in California about how you do this balancing and how you think about managing for what we now have the statement since the Delta Reform Act in 2009 of co-equal goals. In that law, it talks about it for the Delta, but you've really taken it to California as a whole. So I think you're going to have some great thoughts for us too. So now let's kick it off. Jeff gave us some suggestions on stuff that we could do better, starting with improving our preparation, finding some cash spending the cash well that we've gotten through thanks to the voters approving the bond, but also getting some more, and then having a plan, which specifically a biodiversity task force to figure out how to kind of prepare. So like to hear your reactions to that. We'll kind of go through the panel sure. and hear those.
Happy New Year. It's great to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience. I don't know who's watching online. I hope many. Hey, I'm going to take some liberty with my first response and say that I like some of what Jeff recommends. We're doing much of it. I have a question about a particular part or two, but I overall think it misses a more important point. And because you are the thought leaders in water, I'll tell you, I think the two parts that are missing is an important acknowledgement to each other how hard this is, and then something about the human effect. So I've been struggling. It was a hard as heck year for our department and others. And I ran across, because of a friend, an ecologist named David Orr. Y'all may know him. He's at Oberlin. In the 90s, he coined the phrase eco-literacy, and more recently in 2010, he published kind of a collection of his essays called, I think, Hope is Imperative. And in one of the essays, which he published in 2007, the title is something like Hope in a Hotter Time. And I was just looking at it recently, and hotter time to me is the same as drought in some sense, because here's what he had to say. So optimism, he says, in these circumstances is like whistling as one walks past the graveyard at midnight. There's no good case to be made for it, but the sound of whistling sure beats the sound of rustling in the bushes beside the fence. He says, hope, however, requires us to check our optimism at the door and enter the future without illusions, right? It requires a level of honesty, self-awareness, and sobriety that is difficult to summon and sustain. Hope requires the courage to reach farther, dig deeper, confront our limits and those of nature, work harder. And then he wraps up this essay by saying, quote, I know a great many smart people and many very good people, but I know far fewer people who can handle hard truth gracefully without despair. Okay, so last year in 2014, our department had a roster of never been there befores, right, because of this drought. We closed fishing to some waters in the state in January. I remember a phone call from Director Mark Cowan about the same time telling me we may not have enough water in our reservoirs to avoid what's called the dead pool effect. As you know, we had a 0% allocation about a year ago to our state water project. Last year, we and the federal government moved about 30 million salmon smolts out of our combined hatchery system because the river conditions were too low. We thought they would be doomed to death. We evacuated some of our hatcheries because Folsom Lake was too low to provide cold water to our downstream hatcheries. We've done over 300 fish rescues in over 25 watersheds in the state. Just in the Scott Shasta tributary system to the Klamath, we've moved over 150,000 coho from dried up spots in those watersheds to wet spots in those watersheds. Sandy will talk about, the highest number of birds on the flyway ever coming out of the Midwest and Canada to some of the driest habitat ever in the state. I had no idea we'd have multiple days where there were bears wandering around downtown Bakersfield because of drought. And we've got examples like the Amorosa vole out in the desert. We think there are about 100 of them. So us and the Fish and Wildlife Service went out and put radio collars on 20, brought 10 in for captive breeding, and rolling the dice with the rest. So Jeff, I couldn't agree more with this idea of preparation. For example, I didn't know we would have human-wildlife interface like we had because of drought in a way that required me to think about my capacity. Now, we have placed around the state in the hot spots the right number of bear traps and other equipment to deal with what we project will happen again this summer. And we've built and moved fish trucks to certain spots in the state where if we have to bring fish into captive breeding, we can do it in a local watershed and put them in our trucks. I'm all for doing dry runs. I say that as the director of the department has the Office of Oil Spill Prevention and Response. If you look on that side of government, they drill all the time. On a regular basis, they sit down with all levels of affected government. They sit down with industry and they mock drill in the marine environment that a ship hits the Golden Gate. Knock on wood, every one of you, please. And then they drill the response to it. Seems we could transfer that skill set into drought as well. I'm all for priority habitat. It's easy to say. And I'm certain you, Dr. Mountain, you, Dr. Moyle, may not agree on what you think I should prioritize, which is the art of prioritization. But we've done that, right? So our department with the National Marine Fisheries Service launched a voluntary drought initiative with Chair Marcus and the State Water Resources Control Board. We picked Mill Creek, Deer Creek, Antelope Creek in the Upper Sacramento system, the Russian River, and the Scott and Shasta in the Klamath. And we said if landowners will work with us on the fish front and we can design flow regimes, we'll go with them to the board and suggest the board not do emergency curtailments. We've done over 20 of those around the state. More funding would be better. And I agree with you on the planning front, although I'm not persuaded we need an Uber plan. I could be persuaded. It would be interesting to see the product of it. We take planning to heart. Perhaps we were caught unaware in a planning sense, which is why we've now gone out and done 46 and counting contingency drought plans for our own properties to cover about 280,000 of our own acres so that this coming year we can do better with our own water efficiencies and figure out, okay, with limited water coming in as a water contractor, which we are from the Bureau, are we going to use it for the benefit of migratory waterfowl or garter snake? and sort through our own decision-making matrix to have those plans ready before we arrive. So this is my initial remarks. I look forward to the panel. So I like some of it. I'm not persuaded about all of it, Jeff.
Thank you. Sandy.
Hi, everyone. So I am the lucky mom of a 3.5-year-old. And the other day, we got a mention from the teacher that he'd gotten a little upset during an art project. So this was an art project where they were taking little hand squirt bottles and they were spraying water on paper. And apparently my little guy started yelling at his classmates saying, "You're wasting water, there's a drought." And he really took it to heart in such a way that the teacher actually had to talk to him. So this story, I've gone through a series of emotions around this story, which, you know, at first I was like proud of him that he understands the world that he lives in. And then I was incredibly depressed because this is the world that he lives in. This is something that at 3.5, he has to take this into account in an art project. But I think the takeaway for me is sort of where Chuck started, which is with hope. That if we can raise this next generation of kids to be aware of things like drought and empower them to think that if they can change how they do their art project in nursery school, that it is possible that we can operate this system that works for everything. And I think that includes migratory birds. Prior to this session, I was chatting with someone who said, "So what were birds in this drought? We didn't really hear a lot about birds." And you guys probably drove here looking overhead, and I'm guessing you saw some of them flying over. This is the heart of the Pacific Flyway. This is one of the last great migrations on the planet Earth. We are responsible for stewarding it. We have millions of animals that come thousands of miles every year that land in the Central Valley. There are people who travel to East Africa to see a great migration when it's right here in our backyard. So we have an obligation to protect this natural resource. It's amazing. And in fact, it's at a fraction of what it used to be. So historically, you hear settler accounts of it, clouds of birds swirling and darkening the sky, concentrations gathering at night and sleeping together and being so loud that people can't go to sleep at night. Those were the densities that existed historically. We're down to a percentage of them now. In the 80s, we were down to about 15% of the waterfowl that used to be on the flyway. And it's actually a great conservation success story, right? We took action as a community. We restored habitat. We worked with farmers to put habitat on private lands. And we've been able to bring the flyway back up to a healthy state. So I took to heart a lot what Jane said about thinking about drought and creating robust and resilient ecosystems that can go through booms and also cycle with the natural state of Mediterranean climate and go through those drought cycles. And that's about creating the refugia, and it's about making sure that the system's robust enough to handle those downturns. So with respect to what Jeff recommends, I'm all for preparing, I'm all for funding, preparation, and response. I also think we can think about some specific measures to take with respect to migratory birds. So I'd like to offer three thoughts there. The first is we have an existing law that requires that water be delivered each year to the wildlife refuges that the public has invested in. So there are 19 refuges in the Central Valley, and these refuges are supposed to get enough water to manage it properly. This is the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, and since it was passed in 1992, we've managed to utterly fail in delivering that water in almost every single instance. This is a mandate. It is a law, similar to the Endangered Species Act. CVPIA was passed by Congress, and it has been on the books since '92, and we are not fulfilling that mission. If we want a resilient Pacific Flyway to withstand these drought periods, and we need to make tough trade-offs, I get it, we have to have those refuges, and we have to have the flyway in a healthy state. So making sure that we have full refuge deliveries, especially in the non-drought years, is critically important. The second thing I'd offer is we have to think about new tools to deliver conservation. In this case, I think some of what we need to do as a conservation community is better define what water is needed when and where, be more specific. And then we need to have the ability to deliver that habitat. And it may be that that habitat isn't permanent. It may have to be dynamic and temporary. And we don't currently have a lot of ways to do that funding with public dollars to support those efforts. Finally, in closing, if we want to understand what's going on out there, we need to be monitoring. I don't know how many meetings people were running off to, and they would come in and say, well, so what's happening? How do we know? How does this compare to historic records? All of this stuff, it's really hard to tell. The ecosystems are dynamic and the impact of drought is multi-year. The only way for us to know is to have a good monitoring system. So I'd add those to Jeff's list as the specifics for birds.
Great, thank you. Dr. Moyle.
Well, as usual, I agree with everything Jeff says. But really, the key there is the need for a game plan for water allocations for the environment. That's why I really like the language that was expressed with the Australian drought, of the idea of clear and unambiguous water rights for the environment. I think if we could figure out how to do that, that would go a long way. Right now, we rely way too much on the Endangered Species Act to protect our aquatic species and species in general, but especially for the aquatic environment. It's the Endangered Species Act that seems to come down to making that final decision about how much water to allocate. That always seems to result in endless lawsuits. It'd be really nice if we could get away from that. And I really appreciate the fact that the Department of Fish and Wildlife is engaging in the sort of protect the best of what is left actions in protecting places like Deer and Mill Creeks and so forth. Obviously, it needs to be done. We need to do a lot more of it. We need to have ways to very systematically identify these key places statewide. And they aren't just going to be the places we know about, like Deer and Mill Creeks, but some of these smaller streams as well around the state, some of which are spring-fed, some of which need to have water rights purchased and things of this nature. And one of the problems is so many of our priority actions for the water right now are aimed at the more charismatic species, the salmon, the steelhead, and so forth, which is fine. There also tend to be the endangered species. But we have to recognize that the issue goes way beyond that. We currently have 31 species of fish, just fish alone, that are listed as threatened and endangered under either state or federal acts. My group has just completed a report which the Department of Fish and Wildlife now has on the fish species of special concern in the state. And there are 62 species in that list. These are species that are not listed now but have the potential to be listed in the near future. That tells us that we really need a lot of water for the environment because the fish are just one of the indicators of this. The problem is, of course, a lot of these fish are things like Clear Lake hitch or the Red Hills roach or the hardhead, not exactly charismatic species and don't even have charismatic names.
Hardhead?
Hardhead, yeah. This summer, for example, we were out looking for the Red Hills roach and found that, this is a tiny little minnow, there are about 1,000 fish left in 250 meters of stream. They survived this summer, but it doesn't mean they'll survive next summer. So it's things like this that we really need to be included in all these plans, and this takes really a fairly large-scale effort to make sure all these things are protected. And then another aspect of this that's really important is the re-regulation of our reservoirs. This goes along with the idea, of course, of having definite water allocations for the environment. We've completed a study with Ted Grantham, who was the lead on this, about of all California reservoirs, and providing a tool for the way you can identify which reservoirs you can remanage the streams below these reservoirs, which ones you'll get the most bang for your environmental buck to do that. I think we need to do that systematically statewide, identify those places, again, as Jeff mentioned, doing some prioritization, figure out which streams we can really need to have would benefit most from having flows reallocated for them. We have tools, we even have legal tools for this now. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do for fish and for the aquatic environment that just but it needs a greater prioritization of action. And I'll let it go at that.
Thanks, Peter. Tim.
Put me in the bottom camp. I agree with a lot of what Jeff said, but not with everything that he says. And he does this fee thing, then he goes and sits down in the audience. And you might wonder, I'm the executive director of the water supply agencies. Why am I sitting on this ecosystem panel? I wasn't quite sure when I got the invitation, but I am going to turn it into an opportunity to talk a bit about coequal goals and what coequal goals needs to mean for us to be successful during droughts and non-droughts in the future. Who can disagree with the notion that we need to plan? and we need to plan for the ecosystem. I think we've done that some, not nearly as much. Now, I come from an industry, they've got contingency plans A, B, C, D, and E for the next dry period. Of course, you find out the contingency plan gets immediately interrupted by the politics of current drought conditions, but we do plan from a water supply perspective. I'm not sure the same is quite as true on the ecosystem side, and I think we can do a lot more, and we should do a lot more. Another one of the questions they sent us in advance is any bright spots this year. You listen to what Chuck tells you they've been doing in 2014, and there are lots of creative thinking, lots of bright spots to think about. I don't think he mentioned one that is very prominent in my mind, and that is the experiments that they're doing now to operate the system with real-time turbidity data to move away from rigid rules. You know, if it's April such and such, the flows in Old and Middle Rivers need to be so many CFS. From a co-equal goals perspective, what a foolish way to try and operate the system. And while the turbidity management's not going where I think it turns out wind is pretty important, and that's a complicating factor. But to move away from fixed, rigid systems which are inherently inefficient towards real-time data, real-time monitoring of the system, that's something that I been interested in it for over a decade and was really encouraged to see managers move in that direction. One of the most important things about that kind of real-time management is they have to work together. I mean, they're spending lots of time together figuring out how to move in this or that direction based on what the data is telling them. It is inherently something that forces the silos to work more closely together. And if I have any wishes, it's that we continue to work to break out of the silos that we're in as we move towards a world of co-equal goals, because we still haven't figured that out. I think co-equal goals is absolutely, I don't know, nobody in this room could come up and convince me that it's not the right policy. It is the right policy. It's better than the low-cost water policy that we had for decades, and it's better than the protect the species at any cost philosophy that we're confronted with in ESA management, but none of us know how to put it into action, and we're living that during this drought. We got a goal of co-equal goals, and then we're surrounded by armies that want to do single-purpose management of the system. As I said, we had single-purpose management for decades for low-cost water. We've had single-purpose management for environmental species for the past 25 years. I submit to you that when we figure out how to operate in a world of co-equal goals, it will not look like any of those single-purpose strategies. We've got to invent something completely new, and we need to do it. We need to do it together. And by the way, we can't do it in silos. One of your ideas, a biodiversity task force. Make sure that there's water supply interests on it. We got to be talking in the same room about the same problem at the same time. We're moving in that direction, and I commend Chuck and others for the progress that they're making. But we haven't even begun to climb this mountain that is co-equal goals and to figure out what it means for how we operate the system.
And it's
You look like you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
It's doable.
Yeah.
I think so.
So I mentioned David Orr because this is hard. And the thing I forgot to say is it's so hard. You can literally see the human effect. You know, you look at any one of the water supply districts last year and you could see how hard it was for them personally. You go down to the south part of the valley and you could see the human effect. My staff went out near Shasta and brought in the last, what they think might be the remaining 1,000 red band McCloud trout. And we've got them in our Mount Shasta hatchery, which is the longest running hatchery west of the Mississippi. And they're so personal about this. They have refused to feed our normal trout feed we would give to hatchery fish to those red band. They've set up bug zappers. And they're catching native bugs on the property and feeding the fish. Hopefully they'll get around to putting them back in their home waters. But we need empathy. This is about California. I got to understand that it's hard for Tim's folks and expect that they'll understand that it's hard for my folks. So Thad Bittner at Glen Colusa Irrigation District came to NIMS, and there was a conversation maybe a year ago. And we were all struggling to know if we'd have enough cold water in Shasta Reservoir. That matters for a whole variety of public safety reasons, but also winter run. We've got huge temperature lethality problems. We're looking at a potential brood year failure of winter run. And Thad agreed with his folks in his district to take delivery of water from Shasta, which they arguably might be legally entitled to, at a different time than they would otherwise normally do it, so we could cover some of those salmon beds and deal with the temperature risk. And we got to that outcome because we understood each had a problem. It's on y'all's shoulders, it's on our shoulders to make it through this together.
Well, I think one of the things, you hear all these emergency actions are great. I think Jeff hit it though. We need to be able to anticipate these and have facilities that are already set up for not just the salmon and trout, but for things like the red eels roach. And I think one of the important things to recognize is that the legal tools are there as well. We have the public trust doctrine, for example, and part of that is section 5937 of the Fish and Game Code, which do tell us that we're supposed to, rather unambiguously, that we're supposed to protect the aquatic environments, the fish especially, that are below dams. Likewise, Sandy mentioned the CVPIA. That act has some pretty good language in it, and we pretty much failed not only for waterfowl, but for salmon using that act. So I think there's a lot of things that tools out there that we can use to do a better job of protecting our aquatic critters. And Chuck has also made a very important point that this is California. These are pretty much the fish, the birds and so forth. These are California phenomena that if we don't protect it, nobody else is going to.
So I want to ask you guys, you know, one of the subcomponents, because Jeff said he had 3 priorities, but there were actually, I don't know, about 7 in there, sub-bullets. One of them was securing the water. I mean, so there's, you know, sort of figuring out what the priorities are, securing the water, and, you know, Peter, you just mentioned public trust doctrine is one way. Sandy, you mentioned CVPIA, Central Valley Project Improvement Act, so sort of legal tools that potentially allow a judge or, you know, a legislature to just say that water has to come from somebody else and go to the environment. That's definitely a way that California has managed acquiring environmental water. It's not the only way. We also have used the water market to some extent for that purpose, and even actually for the wildlife refuges, some of the water that's going into them is acquired through purchases. And you know, Jane mentioned that when the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was set up, she had that $13 billion price tag, and you know, Australian dollar, US dollar, more or less, you know, close enough for us not to have to worry about converting it. About $3 billion of that was federal money, if I'm right, for acquiring environmental water entitlements, basically environmental water rights. So far, and it's my understanding, I think that some of the states have added in some additional money maybe. But anyway, it's a big chunk of change if you compare with what we've used in California for this purpose. And looking at what we've used for environmental water acquisitions, most of it has been single-year acquisitions, leasing, single-year. In a couple of cases, 12-year deals in the context of the Central Valley Project Improvement Act for some flow improvements. And that's almost all with public dollars, almost all with tax dollars. When that money runs out, then there's no more money to lease the water with. There's a little bit of money now, and I was going to look at Chuck about this, a couple $100 million in the new bond that potentially can be used for improving in-stream flows through acquisitions. It's small compared to $3 billion. It's a start, but I just kind of wanted to ask you guys what you thought about the idea of sort of having a more active way of acquiring some rights for the environment.
I'm okay with that. I have 3 thoughts. The first is to agree with Sandy. I have found as a practitioner, including in the courtroom, arguing some of the laws Peter relies on in the discussion here, that it is helpful from the resource management side to help demystify what it is when we say flow. it's not always the case that the environmental perspective is insisting on full flow, 365 days a year, around the clock. So I agree with Sandy. The more specific you can fashion the discussion, for example, on the salmon front, on this particular period in that month, we need this kind of flow at a riffle for migration purpose, or with regards to a cold water pool for temperature control, say in the lower Klamath. You can really control the problem-solving dialogue down into something that's specific, which I have found helps produce results. My second thought is to comment on funding itself. Look, if the expectation is that the environment has to carry around a checkbook, I think you need to remember that David Orr says we need to be really self-aware and direct in this conversation on these difficult issues. The best we've ever done under CVPIA to get level, I think, 4 is in 2011, and even then we were 25% short. It's almost cost prohibitive when you really are advocating from the environmental perspective. You need to acquire all the water necessary, particularly in this state if you're talking about permanent acquisition, right? So I think that's worth understanding and discussing more. Yes, Proposition 1 does include $200 million to the Wildlife Conservation Board, which I chair, for enhanced stream flow. There are important limitation conditions in the proposition, like if you were to pursue that through the tool of leasing, you need a really long term to avoid the problem that 1 year after 1 year after 1 year you're paying exorbitant prices for not a great return. There are also limitations around if it's a permanent acquisition, making sure you're acquiring water that, if you will, floats on top of an already existing mitigation responsibility. But jumping ahead, one of my priorities for 2015 is to help stand up a legitimate, done in transparent fashion, enhanced stream flow type program that is an implementation step of the California Water Action Plan. I think that would be good for California. I think it would be smart ecological and kind of environmental program building. And I think it's entirely consistent with Prop 1 and the California Water Action Plan.
Terrific. Others on this point?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to this idea of being more specific about water needs, I think this is a challenge. It's a science challenge, and I think that we have new tools available to us to kind of step up and start to meet this challenge. And I have a concrete example of this actually working for us. Over the past about year and a half or so, the Nature Conservancy has been working on this pilot program called Bird Returns. And this is a program that's based on two sources of big data, basically, satellite imagery and eBird data that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has developed. And the idea here is, can we get to what Chuck was saying? Can we say exactly what weeks and how much water we need to support migratory birds in California? And we've successfully done this, defining 2 windows in the spring and the fall. This year we're delivering about 14,000 acres of cost-effective habitat that's temporary. So what we asked farmers basically was, hey, look, we have a couple of windows here where we need some shallow water for shorebirds, just 4 inches, for 2, 4, and 6 week increments. Can you help us? What will it cost you to provide that habitat? We basically took those bids in, ran a reverse auction, and picked those that were most cost effective. And the result was that actually, and I'm not saying that this is a replacement, I'm saying it's a complement, but it's actually cheaper to do this temporary habitat, paying annually each year over hundreds of years, than it would be to buy similar habitat today. So it's not a replacement for permanent protection, but we also need to start to think about new tools to get the habitat on the ground. The real big challenge here is, okay, so new tools, that's fabulous. We have built an institution around permanent protection in this state, and we're awesome at it. So the water bond is a wonderful example of something that can pay for capital projects. When I go in and talk to Chuck and I talk to other folks about this program of kind of this annual payment temporary habitat idea, especially in plugging holes around drought, Forgot to mention, we actually mobilized around the drought and knew the winter was a problem, and actually have 5,000 acres out right now that we put out there in less than 2.5 months to respond to the drought impacts to birds. But there's no public funding source available to do this kind of thing. It's a new tool, it's a different tool, it's not a tool to solve all environmental problems, but we need to begin to think about, as we've developed these new funding sources, Jeff mentioned having more stable revenues, allowing for new tools, allowing to experiment with new ideas, and bring the next kind of idea forward. So I think we need to solve this problem through a combination of sort of what we've done in the past that has worked, and thinking forward, pushing the science to be more specific, and then challenging us from a policy front to create those enabling conditions that can support new approaches.
You guys want to add here, or should we open up?
Let's go ahead and, well, okay,
Quick.
really briefly.
Yeah.
I've got this economics degree. I was one of the architects of the environmental water account. Didn't necessarily work out all that well. So while I would agree, let's experiment with market forces, I think we need to be careful about it and a bit cautious. I think, more importantly, we need to restructure our working relationships with each other to where we're all willing to embrace the objectives of the other side and work for something that looks like co-equal goals. And that requires rearranging your DNA for most all of us. It's not that there are good people and bad people. It's when you're in control of the system, you drive it to meet your needs and you shift risks to others. We did that when we were in control, and ESA regulators do that when they're in control. Both of those winds up to what an economist is highly inefficient. And if we figure out a way to do co-equal goals and share benefits, we can create a lot of added wealth for both interests and wind up a lot better than we are. But you got to have people let go of their single purpose mindset in order to get there, and that's what I think we're struggling with right now.
I'd like to add just one quick thing. Sandy mentioned the examples of what works, and I think we need to get more of those out there. The example that I use all the time is Pewter Creek, because it's a system where we've designed a flow regime for it that really takes a minimal amount of water. So, and it also has a very good drought contingency plan associated with it. It's been very successful. We got lots of native fish, native birds, everything else is responding to this. I think one of the key things there is it's got strong local support, including the support of the Solano Water Agency, and it also has a full-time person, a full-time stream keeper who actually is an employee of the water agency, whose job is simply to go around and solve the various small problems that develop anytime you have a major restoration project like that. So I think there are good models out there that we can follow for a lot of these projects or potential projects around the state.
On that hopeful note, I'm going to open up for a little bit of Q&A. We've got a question from Bruce Herbold.
Gosh, I get introduced. I'm just astounded that in this call for non-single species controls and all of that, the Clean Water Act does that. The State Water Board is addressing delta flows right now, but nobody mentioned that. Why is that? What's wrong with the Clean Water Act as the tool to address all of these issues?
Bruce has an affiliation bias there, perhaps. He's with the Environmental Protection Agency.
He's retired now.
Oh,
That's
retired.
why he can suddenly speak freely,
Hey.
like he never did before.
Bruce, all I can tell you is if you went to my constituency and picked 10 at random and said, do you think we're getting co-equal goals out of the current application of Clean Water Act through the State Water Resources Control Board, you wouldn't get a single agency that thought we were. In point of fact, we need to figure this out in implementing the Clean Water Act and the Environmental Species Act and our own water supply reliability plans. Nobody's getting it right, and we're at each other's throats, and we're not going to be, I don't think that was true back when I was getting to know you 20 plus years ago. In the mid-90s, there actually, the Bay Delta Accord, there was actually a spirit of trying to recognize the legitimacy of the other folks' objectives. And I think we made a lot of progress for about 6, 7, 8 years. And then it fell apart and we're back at playing gotcha politics today, and we need to get back to something like where we were in the mid-90s.
Hey, Bruce, I think I'm going to botch the attribution. It might be Carl Sagan, but what is it? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think the failure for us to mention the water quality control planning proceedings at the board is not because I don't believe in the both validity and importance of that proceeding. In fact, I can contemplate a future where our department is a catalyst in watersheds around the state, trying to work with water users and conservationists at a local scale to design projects which include ag efficiencies, infrastructure investment, taking water savings and dedicating them to the environment, potentially figuring out fish passage and putting salmon back in historical habitat where they haven't been for 100 years, ... And that outcome then needing to be plugged in completely to the jurisdictions over at EPA and the State Water Board, because most of these parties want the same result, which is I want some measure of certainty about those species in my jurisdiction, just like a water user wants some measure of certainty about what Chair Marcus and the board may do in their proceedings. And if we can get to this spot where you can foster I don't have to oppose you getting your interests met so long as it's reasonable in exchange for you working with me to get my interests met. I actually think we're more likely to have product we can push through all the appropriate permitting and regulatory restrictions. That's how I see this hopefully working. Fingers crossed.
With that hopeful statement, and with Tim nodding his head in agreement, I'm going to say that Katrin is telling me that we've got to wrap up, and so we're going to thank you all for this wonderful panel. Instructions to all of you are that the fine folks here at the Sheraton want to feed us, and what that means is that either take a little break out in the hall for 10 minutes, or you can stay at your seat. But don't be mingling, or if you're mingling around, don't do it in the room because they need to be able to get to the tables. And if you do leave your seat, put your things on your chair so they have room to set you up, please. And we'll be back here at 1. Thank you.